Thank you so much, Chuck. And I do remember those conversations very well because they were difficult ones. You were persuasive. You were persuasive. What Chuck didn't mention, which I've always had a huge amount of respect for you for, was that when I did get the Rhodes Scholarship, which actually was somewhat time dependent, you had to apply, but before you were 24 years old, and because I taught, it changed the timeline a little bit, and so I just got in under the wire. Had I been at Carolina fourth year, I wouldn't have been eligible, and I remember very clearly, Chuck, you called my house and you said, you know, I thought you were making the wrong decision, but I was wrong. You did the right thing for you, and that really always meant a lot. I really appreciate that. It is a joy to be here with you tonight. I'm so grateful to the Morehead-Cain Foundation in so many different ways, to Chuck and Megan for this invitation in particular. It was wonderful to have a chance to speak with our chancellor this evening and learn a little bit more about where the university is headed. And to the Morehead-Cain staff, to fellow alums who are here, to faculty and staff from the university, current scholars, and especially our finalists, it is wonderful to see you. Thank you so much for giving me this time. To our finalists, I realized as I was preparing this that I sat in your place 20 years ago, and that seems like such a long time. And to be very honest, most of my finals weekend is a blur to me. I really don't remember huge amounts of it. It was a life-changing blur, but it was a blur nonetheless, and so I'm grateful to have this chance to be back and maybe try and piece together what it must have been like. I know to all our finalists that you have worked so hard to get here, and I just want to acknowledge that and congratulate you for that, but I also hope that this weekend has been a good change of pace for you. I know you had interviews, I know it's been intense in a variety of different levels, but I hope it's been a nice change of pace from the busyness of senior year. I know you have a lot of things that are going on, and I hope you can take this time just to breathe a little bit. Chapel Hill is always good for breathing. So, as I said, it's a privilege to be here with you, and I'm coming with both a question and a reflection for you. The question is the first thing that I want you to ponder, and the question is, what will you do with your one wild and precious life? This isn't an original question to me. Many of you may have heard it before. It's from the late poet Mary Oliver in her poem, The Summer Day. What will you do with your one wild and precious life? My reflection this evening is on how I've chosen to answer that question, but I just want to give a little caution. My mother, who's a very wise woman, always reminded me as I was growing up, don't make other people's experiences a rule for you, right? I'm not giving you rules. I'm just telling my story, and maybe it'll just help prompt some thinking for you as you think about your own journey. So if I want to answer this question, I could start with a long explanation of my job, what my current position is in Baltimore, what I do day to day, but as I step back and reflect, what's clear to me is that my current job is just the current manifestation of what I've chosen to do with my life more broadly. Right, which is building bridges and advocating for equity and justice. These particular callings, and I view them as callings, are intricately and really intimately woven with the Morehead-Cain, with my time at Carolina, and I was drawn to the UNC and to the Morehead because of my kind of nascent desire to build bridges and to be an advocate. And while I was here, my time here really clarified that calling and equipped me to do that work in really meaningful ways. So my current job, just so you do know what I do, is that I coordinate Baltimore's efforts to ensure that every student has a post-secondary option that's a good match for them, that's aligned with their interests and aligned with their passions. And that work has its roots in my own story. Someone once told me that often our work is autobiographical, and that's very true for me. It comes out of my own story and my family's story. So bear with me while I go back a little bit. This story starts long before me, with a grandmother who, although she only made it to the 8th grade before she was orphaned and had to leave school in order to work to support herself, valued education really highly. And because of that, she was living in DC. She was dissatisfied with the education that her children were getting in the local schools. And so she decided to write R.J. Reynolds a letter telling him that she was dissatisfied with the education her students were getting and asking Mr. Reynolds with his grand tobacco fund to help her sons attend a better school. For whatever reason, I think it's probably divine intervention. I have no reason to know why he read her letter, but he chose to respond. And he sent someone up to DC to meet with my uncles at the time, realized that actually there were some options for them, and R.J. Reynolds paid for my uncles to attend the Woodbury Forest School, a private all-boys boarding school in Virginia. They were some of the first Black students at Woodbury Forest, and had all the interesting experiences that come with being new. But that opportunity to attain an education that looked very different than what they were getting before was life-changing. And it was life-changing not just for them, but for my mother, who came a little bit later, and ultimately for me. My grandmother's belief that just because her children were poor, just because they had dark skin, did not mean that they needed to settle for an inferior education, is one that frames my work today. She planted the seeds, and they're still growing in our family. So let's fast forward to my own school experience. I went to National Cathedral School, a private girls' boarding, it was not boarding, private girls' school in Washington, D.C. And my experience there was interesting because my classmates were, on the whole, wealthier than I was, and we lived about 25 miles outside of town. So, Chancellor, we were talking about how you drive your daughter to school, and I have incredible memories of my dad driving me the hour into school and the hour back every day. He knew more gossip about what was happening with the girls in my class than probably a number of the girls in my class did. And even still, he'll be like, so how is so-and-so? And how did that situation work out for her? That was a little tricky. So I attended the school on the scholarship. I worked in the library to help pay some of to cover the costs of my education there. And that time there was hugely life-changing for me. It was the first time that I felt like I was in an environment where I could just be as nerdy as I wanted to be, and not only did people not care, but they were actually doing the same thing too. Remember, I started in middle school, and I remember a middle school conversation, and this is pre-physics for all of you physics folks out there, where we had this long discussion during lunch about how we know that the colors, that what we call blue is actually blue. And could it be something else? And what if the person who first called it blue was colorblind and it actually is green, right? And physics gets us to that a little bit later. But these were the kinds of things that I felt comfortable being able to have conversations about. And it was a great space for me there. But as I was there, the longer I was there, one of the things that really became abundantly clear to me was that the experiences that I was having were very different than the experiences that my cousins were having, that my neighbors were having, that friends at church were having. And I really started to ponder what was happening there. We were talking at our table about learning languages and just thinking through how you go about learning a language, what's the process, how is it taught. At my school, my language classes, French in particular, were taught entirely in French. And if you spoke English, you could see the teacher and she would go and she'd make a little note and you knew that you were getting points deducted, right? So which makes you either be really quiet or learn French really quick, and I did both of those during that time. By my senior year in my French classes, we were reading philosophical texts in French, right? And we were writing essays about them in French, we were discussing them in French, and it was basically an English class. It was a literature class, I should say. It was just in French. And I would talk to friends and hear a little bit about what they were doing, and often it was something like they had a class in English, and the teacher had vocabulary words that were in French, and they had the worksheets that they worked out in the book with the text, and they would go through and they would learn the vocabulary, and it might be posted on the walls. But the class was still primarily in English, and then English was being used to teach French. Those are very different experiences. And there was nothing about my experience that I deserved to have, or I should say nothing about me that I would have deserved to have the experience I had any more than my peers deserved to have that experience, but we were getting very different experiences. And those examples compound over the years. So by the time I was looking at college, I had some friends who decided it really wasn't for them, even though we'd started out with kind of the same trajectory coming out of elementary school. Right? I had some friends who could have taken advanced placement classes, but they weren't really sure why, and nobody actually talked to them about why it might have been in their interest, and so they just didn't because they didn't really see the point in doing extra work, and nobody gave them another narrative. And so I was starting to develop a sense of a concern about what I was seeing as injustice, right, through this process, because things were happening to people. They weren't actively making choices about them, and that really concerned me. And so as I came through my time in high school, I came out with a very clear conclusion that nobody should have to spend a significant amount of money in order to get a quality education. If you would like to spend it, that's great, feel free. But you shouldn't have to in order to ensure that the education that you get is one that is going to open doors for you in the future. So I'm going to switch a little bit to my college process because I know you guys are in the thick of this, obviously. This is why we're here today. This is also what I do for a living, and so I spend a lot of time thinking about colleges. And I should say I never expected to be in North Carolina, so I'll throw that out initially. When I met with my college advisor at school, initially I told her, I'm very interested in Yale. That was the school that a number of my classmates had gone to. I was able to visit someone who'd graduated a couple years ahead of me there, and the old buildings and the history of it, and just the sense of, this intellectual conversation happening around campus was really appealing. And so it seemed like a great next step. My family was excited. They were like, great, this is terrific. You're on board. My aunt bought me a jacket. It said Yale on the back. It was great. Gotta love family with that. They're right there. They're like, you like it? You visited? We got you a jacket. You're on board. And I was all ready to apply to make my home in New Haven. That was where I was looking. And so when I met with my college advisor at the end of my junior year, I confidently told her that, leaving my options open, I would like to go to a medium-sized liberal arts college in New England. So naturally, of course, she nominated me for the Morehead-Cain to attend a large public research university in North Carolina. Sometimes you don't feel heard, No, she was great. She's incredibly supportive, and her nomination was significant in my life. My Morehead journey began with a visit to North Carolina during the summer, and I was speaking with the chancellor about this. When my family and I walked on campus, coming down from Maryland, we didn't know where we were going, and so we were trying to figure out how we were navigating around, and someone stopped and said, are you lost? Could I help you find directions? And we all kind of looked at each other, like, are they talking to us? Right? That is not typically the way people engage in the DC area, I'll tell you that. And like, they're so friendly here. And by the time I came down for finalist weekend, and one of the things I do remember from finalist weekend is that I was interviewed by a Morehead alumna who was a stay-at-home mom, and that really stuck with me. That was really meaningful because all of a sudden I was seeing the Morehead, it was Morehead then, so forgive me if I'm switching back and forth with Morehead and Morehead-Cain, that valued things about people. They valued things that were beyond just what they did or what they put on a resume, and they found that being a stay-at-home mom was something that was valuable, right? And it just really struck me. I thought, who are these people, right? This is different. This is different than the world that I am currently inhabiting, where, even now as an adult, the first question is typically, what do you do, right? And if you don't give the right answer, they may or may not talk to you. And so it became clear to me that the Moreheads I was meeting, the Carolina students I was meeting were smart, right? That actually didn't take long to figure out at all. People were passionate about ideas. They would have joined me in that middle school conversation about colors, right? But there was also a passion that was underlying the intelligence, and a particular passion that was tied to how their intellect could be used to help other people. And that was really interesting because, as Chuck mentioned, I was getting that in that direction myself, right? I was coming out of this high school experience. I was seeing disparities. I was trying to think about what I wanted to do about it. And so I met people when I ultimately came to Carolina, like my friend David Jernigan, who became so passionate about education during his Morehead summers, that he, though he was in the business school, decided to, and he actually, I think, got an award for his business thesis, decided to go in a different direction and become a teacher down in Atlanta, and is currently the deputy superintendent for education in the Atlanta Public School District. I met people like Robin Hadley, who traded in a career at the Import-Export Bank because she realized that students in Graham, North Carolina, where she had grown up, weren't getting equal access to college opportunities, and so she decided she was going to jump in head first, and she's now the Associate Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs at Washington University in St. Louis. Or, as a particular special memory of Carolina, people passionate like the Carolina student I saw early one morning when I walked into campus. Not a morning person, so I kind of stumbled my way through and realized that someone was standing alone in the pit, dressed as a banana, with a sign that said, Folic Acid Awareness Day. I love the passion that my fellow Tar Heels bring to the world. So my decision to choose UNC was one of the first conscious decisions I think I made to choose something that was unexpected, right? There was already a clear kind of, if not a set path, you know how you have well-trod routes, right, where you see, like, especially if they're shortcuts, where it's not an official path, but like everybody walks on it, so it kind of gets worn down. There were those same kind of opportunities coming out of my high school. There was a sense that people went to similar types of schools, right? There was a sense that people did certain things with those degrees. And I realized that all of a sudden I had the chance to do something a little different. And I had the chance, I began to realize, to maybe become someone a little different. And I didn't know how I was going to become different, but I was really curious. And so I accepted the Morehead-Cain. As I recognized, I did have this chance and had an interesting conversation with the admissions officer at Yale explaining this, that I had the chance to become a different kind of person. And so when I came to Carolina, I realized it was an opportunity to expand my vision of the world. And part of that was recognizing that I hadn't even realized where my vision of the world had been limited. So a couple days into the start of school, my freshman year, just about 20 years ago, I met Bomi Roberson, his friend who's here with me tonight, and realized in conversation that Bomi had spent much of her childhood in Lagos, Nigeria, and that our experiences growing up as teenagers actually weren't all that different. They weren't as different as I would have expected. And at some point, we actually had the same song that we were jamming to, right? I like to think that we were both sitting on our beds in different countries listening to the same song. And that was pretty cool, to realize that somebody who grew up an ocean away was having similar experiences. I also met, while at Carolina, some friends who were from Accra, Ghana, who I eventually was able to travel with some other Carolina buddies to go see and celebrate Ghana's 50th anniversary of independence with them, right? Those doors got opened because of people who I, quite frankly, sat around and ate Chinese takeout with, right? I discovered that from my roommate, who was from Laurinburg, North Carolina. Do we have anybody from Laurinburg here? Oh, I'm so excited. That's wonderful. I'll have to let her know. But she helped open my eyes to what life in a smaller town in a more rural area was like. And I am forever indebted to her for the first kind of coaching conversation I had when I was down here, where she, and I paraphrase, essentially said to me, "You walk too fast, you talk too fast, you don't speak to people who are speaking to you, and you're going to have to adapt if you're going to live down here." It was great advice. I adjusted my pace walking to class. I now wave at people who I previously would have considered strangers. I had to learn to take risks and try new things. And I started learning that when I was at National Cathedral School, right, coming from a different community. I started to learn how to build these bridges between communities. But all of a sudden, being at North Carolina just accelerated that. I realized it was something that I could do more often. I could move outside my comfort zone. I could make connections, across lines of difference. And that started to be something that I not only could do, but wanted to do. And I got better at it the more I did it. UNC was full of opportunities to engage intellectually and then apply my learning practically. And I think that was something that became more and more important to me while I was here. I took philosophy and ethics courses, and those courses were great for debates and going back and forth. But what was actually happening at the time was that I was getting the foundation I needed to develop a framework about equity that I still use today, right? They weren't just classes for classes' sake. They were classes that were directed toward the impact that I wanted to start to have in the world. I also drew upon those classes when I served in the honor court, and in incredibly difficult decisions, and with such pride in being part of a student-run system. It was great to have some philosophy and some ethics backing to lean on as we started to think through those decisions. I took a class on educational policies, but what I learned really got framed for me in the summer that I spent working at a charter school that had just opened in New Haven, Connecticut. I did get to New Haven eventually, just for the summer. And watching the sacrifices that the teachers were making there, that the Morehead alum who invited me there were making in order to support students was really sobering, right? I had said I wanted to do all this with education, but these teachers were working 80 hours a week. Daisha told the executive director who was there was pulling all kinds of long hours, and I had to step back and say, wow, is this really what it's taking for students to get what they need? I learned to build bridges when I spent time at a venture capital firm that invested money in public education and got kind of dived in head first into the what it meant to be a part of this venture capital world, and what is this business community, and people are interested in education and they want to fund education. How does that actually work, and can it work? Are these things that can be in partnership? Is there always going to be tension? And if so, how do you deal with that? That was very practical and extended beyond any of the education policy classes that I took. And then ultimately in my senior year, with a great introduction from Chuck, I was able to create an independent study course where I was able to shadow the superintendent of the Chapel Hill Carborough School District, Dr. Neil Peterson. And it was invaluable to be able to step out of the books for a little bit and sit in some of the meetings with him and realize how difficult it was to move toward equity. Right? Even with an intention, a set intention, it was so complicated and there were so many competing interests, and it really gave me, quite frankly, a vision toward what I'm doing now. Choosing Carolina equipped me to continue to exercise that muscle of crossing divides and thinking about advocacy and how to advocate in practical ways. And it's become a way of life for me. You know, as Chuck mentioned, I did this. I went straight into the Mississippi Delta to teach 4th grade when I left Carolina, and it was eye-opening to see a part of the country that in many ways had been left behind, right? People often would tell me that just having more money doesn't change things in education, and I would say, well, my roof is leaking right now, and so I have arranged my classroom around buckets while water drips, hopefully not on my students, and money actually would fix that, right? The teachers in my school don't have access to a photocopier, so I'm driving to Staples, 30 miles away from the school, so I can make photocopies for my class. And I'm a new teacher, so I hope I get it all right on Sunday night, but chances are I probably didn't, right? That's something that could be addressed with a little bit more money. And so being able to actually jump in and not just talk about policies, not just think through what might need to happen in classrooms, but to try and figure out how to do it was incredibly humbling. It was my first dramatic failure. I was not very good at being a teacher, but it will always stick with me because it is what people choose to do every day in order to make things better for their students, right? And I have a huge amount of respect for that and a huge responsibility to advocate for both our students and teachers getting what they need. Just a few years later, I was at it again. I was crossing an ocean this time, going to England, where I got the chance to look at how policies were affecting different people differently. I talked to families of African and Caribbean descent in Britain to understand how they were navigating school choice and how it looked different for them than it might have looked for some of the white British families who were there as well. Which leads to the work I do now. So my father grew up in Baltimore. And my grandmother, aunts, uncles, cousins still are there. Every now and then, one of the greatest joys of my job is being able to mix that family work connection and to pop into one of the schools where some of my cousins' kids go. And it's always funny because it's out of context, right? And so sometimes you see them and you just see their eyes get really big. What is she doing here? The last time we saw her, she was eating chicken at the barbecue. And so in the work in Baltimore, I'm still building bridges. Last Thursday was an interesting day. I started out my day meeting with a principal who'd recently experienced some of the violence in the city that had infiltrated the school. And so somebody from outside came in and shot someone in the school. And so navigating that with him and trying to figure out how I could support from the work that my office does, and just, you know, really great principal, great thinker, and to be able to work alongside someone like that is really a privilege. I then transitioned to a community meeting where there were some really passionate and frustrated parents who were telling the district how we were getting things wrong, right? And so, you know, needed to be able to hear that, hear their viewpoint, understand where things weren't quite going right, and be able to think through how we respond. I then shifted to another meeting, which was held in a different part of town with local philanthropists and faith leaders, where, you know, someone was walking around serving drinks, and we were sharing about a new mentoring program, and it was a very different group of people than I had just met with at the community meeting. And being able to pivot in all those situations and to feel comfortable in all those situations, and to really be able to help connect all those groups of people is what I learned and skills I built here at Carolina. Well, on the surface, it might just look like my job is getting students to college or to a job. Really, the underlying work is tackling the years and years of systemic decisions that have led to poverty and consequently poor educational outcomes. I don't know how many of you are familiar, but in the 1930s, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation identified they started ranking neighborhoods, essentially. So there were neighborhoods that were very desirable, and there were neighborhoods that were what they called hazardous. And the neighborhoods that were hazardous tended to have in common that they had ethnic minorities, racial minorities who lived there, and so in doing so, what they did was they either denied home loans or they made getting a loan very, very expensive and complicated for people who lived in those areas that were labeled hazardous. And so while this might seem like something that you just read about in your history textbook, it still has implications today. Those neighborhoods were on their maps outlined in red. And we see the implications of that redlining, even though in the Fair Housing Act banned those practices, we still see the implications now. So I just saw a recent study that said that 3 out of 4 areas that were redlined back in the 30s are still entrenched in poverty today, right? We haven't, 1930s to 2012, and there's still significant impact in those areas. And when you look at Baltimore from a 2019 perspective, what you see is that the areas that remain disadvantaged are the areas that were redlined back in the 30s, right? Very clear connection. You can overlay the maps, and it's almost identical, right? So it's really easy to think sometimes when you're just looking from an outside perspective that it's about individuals who aren't making the right choices, and that's why young people aren't seeing academic success, or it's about parents, sometimes people will look at. But what they don't look at are things like the highway in Baltimore that conveniently allows you to get up to kind of the leafy green areas without ever having to drive through some of the most affected neighborhoods, right? So you literally can just get on the highway and zoom right past them and you don't have to see it. Right, how that affects the way that Baltimoreans of all different backgrounds see the city, right? It really has a lot to do with the vantage point they have. Is your vantage point on Highway 83, right, or is it on the neighborhoods that surround it? The implications of having lead in your water, of having lead paint on your walls, knowing that that has an impact on brain development. The implications of having poor access to transportation, but the need to be able to go from the east side to the west side to the north side in order to get things done, because sometimes we make processes really complicated. All of these things, even having to make short-term financial decisions, right, where you have to put money in a certain place rather than being able to invest it in another place because, you were a little bit late on rent, and so you're told you have to move, but it's really hard for you to move until you get your deposit back. So where's the money coming from for you to be able to move to a new place? All these things continue to impact the same members of our community, right? And those are the same members who are not seeing the educational success that we would want them to see. So part of my work is to uncover, right, where we've seen both these legislated inequities and where they've just built on, de facto issues over the years, and figure out how we can disrupt these systems, right? So not just thinking about how I'm going to get more students to complete the FAFSA, which I am doing, and I hope all of you have completed yours as well, right? But also thinking through what are the systems that make completing the FAFSA so complicated, right? And how do we actually address things on that level? My current growth as a leader, and I just want to give a quick shout out to Anna Ilyasova, who is a current scholar in her sophomore year who interned in my office last summer, and we were chatting about continued growth. So I have developed some expertise in education, but I'm still developing expertise in education, right? I'm still learning. And part of my current growth is to figure out how to step back from being reactive, right? In a job where I'm constantly getting emails and constantly getting phone calls and constantly hearing about what's wrong, to be able to say, what are the systemic things that I need to help or start to tackle? And where am I actually complicit in moving forward things that are creating inequities for our students? Because I do, right? Because certain things we have rules about, and I say, well, the rule is this. And sometimes I actually need to question the rule rather than just rolling it out. So all of this requires humility, right? It requires a learning posture, requires recognizing that I don't know everything and that I need to keep learning. And So I want to go back for a second to Mary Oliver's question, what will you do with your one wild and precious life? Because as I reflect a little bit more, I think that part of what the Morehead-Cain enabled me to do was to stop worrying so much about what I was doing and start to think more about who I was becoming, right? And it gave me the freedom to think about who I wanted to be. And I want to be really clear. Ultimately, what you do comes out of who you are. I'm going to say that one more time. What you do comes out of who you are. So wherever you attend college, my advice, my encouragement to you is to tend to your soul in the same way that you would tend to your mind, to your intellect, to your body. Cultivate curiosity, build deep friendships, be oriented towards serving others, towards having the humility to ask when you don't know rather than pretending like you do. And engage in what author Ruth Haley Barton calls the practice of turning aside to look. Carolina gave me plenty of time and space to turn aside to look. The Morehead gave me summer opportunities that allowed me to turn aside to look. And when I did, I saw that there was more there than I originally thought. And what I saw started to shape the way I thought about things and ultimately my character. As you do that, you may be surprised at who you're becoming. And I hope you'll be pleased about it too. And then with all due respect to the late Mary Oliver, the doing will come in time. Thank you very much.